consumer watchdog agency.
Any perception that Mr. Kushner has been anything but not only cooperative, but if you look at the contents of these emails, he's the hero.
We've had 8 years of economic stagnation.
This is a terrible, terrible piece of legislation, and it must be defeated.
If we can repeal part of Obamacare as part of a tax bill and have a tax bill that is still a good tax bill that can pass, that's great.
We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat. Roy Moore denies it. That's all I can say.
How can you be a white separatist and represent all the constituents in your state?
Well, welcome to Sunday and good morning to you. We're so grateful for your company. I'm Christy Paul.
And I'm Martin Savage in for Victor Blackwell. Clock is ticking for the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. He has until tomorrow to hand over information related to his security clearance to Congress.
Congressional committees are trying to find out whether Kushner had any inappropriate contacts with Russia during the 2016 presidential campaign. Now, this, as 2 new articles this morning from the New York Times and Washington Post take a closer look at Kushner's apparent shrinking role in the Trump administration.
Meanwhile, the president is slamming the nation's top consumer watchdog group as a total disaster, as questions swirl on just who's going to be in charge tomorrow morning after its former director abruptly quit.
And this week, will it be a make or break moment for the Republican agenda? The question, can the president secure a win on tax reform?
And Democratic Senator Al Franken expected to speak publicly for the first time since several women came forward accusing him of sexual harassment. All right, let's begin with the Russia investigation. CNN's Abby Phillips joins me now live. And Abby, Kushner has been asked to repeatedly turn over documents, 2 or more documents, I should say, related to the 2016 Trump campaign and the transition team. So I'm wondering, is Kushner expected to fully cooperate this time?
Well, good morning, Martin. Yes, Jared Kushner is yet again asked to provide some new documentation to Senate investigators. This has been an ongoing problem for him, where investigators have come back to him and said, you need to give us more emails, you need to give us more documents, and you need to provide transcripts related to this investigation. Now, Kushner's attorneys say that he's been both cooperative and very forthcoming, that he's provided information that relate to his own contacts with Russia and with any other actors that are related to the investigation, and that if congressional investigators are looking for something that they don't have, it's because they didn't necessarily ask for it. So I think we can expect that in the coming days, you'll see Kushner's attorney providing the information that they've asked for, partly because his attorneys say the more that they give investigators at the beginning, the more it vindicates their client. So I think we expect them to actually do that when the deadline approaches tomorrow.
All right, and on another controversy, former Representative Barney Frank pushed back on the White House, saying that President Trump has the authority to appoint a new leader to the nation's top consumer watchdog agency. It's a story we've been following these past few days. You interviewed Frank. What did he say?
That's right. Well, this is a dispute that might go all the way to the courts. When I talked to Barney Frank yesterday, he is one of the co-authors of the law that created the CFPB, and he said that when they were going through and writing this piece of legislation, they thought about how they would put together the succession plan for what would happen if there's no director of the CFPB, and they said that they wanted to make it so that the president and the White House and political actors in the government would not be in part of that process of temporarily replacing a director when there's no one in that position. So they said they designed it for exactly this purpose, and that it was not designed for President Trump to be able to just appoint someone like Mick Mulvaney, the OMB director, to that position. So Barney Frank is on one side of that issue, but the Justice Department's lawyers came out with their opinion yesterday, siding with the president, saying that their interpretation of the law is that the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, that's a whole other law, gives the president full authority to appoint whoever he wants to that position. And on Monday morning, folks are going to come to work at the CFPB. Some of them may not know exactly who they report to. Barney Frank says that he believes this will be settled in court, but he's not exactly sure how or when that will happen.
Could be an awkward Monday. Abby Phillip, thanks very much.
Kelly Jane Torrance, Deputy Managing Editor for the Weekly Standard, and Kyle Felcher, Breaking News Editor for the Washington Examiner, with us now. Thank you both for being here. I want to read to you something regarding Jared Kushner and his notable absence from the public eye, it seems, particularly from the West Wing. Here's what the New York Times is writing. They say in the first months of the administration, Mr. Kushner typically would spend 5 or 6 hours a day with the president in what his advocates described as playing defense, making sure others were not gaming the system by persuading Mr. Trump to make decisions without consulting others who had interest in the issues. Now, under a less free-willing system, Mr. Kushner and other aides are expected to stay in their own lanes. Kelly, is that, in a sense, the John Kelly effect? Is the role shrinking, really, for Kushner, or is it just becoming more focused?
It's a great question, Christy, and I think this is a case definitely of be careful what you wish for. Jared Kushner reportedly was one of the big forces behind getting Reince Priebus out as chief of staff, and now look what happened. That led to John Kelly coming in as chief of staff, and he has really curbed Jared Kushner's access during the day to Donald Trump, and it is quite a striking difference. And I sort of wonder, though, if the focus is there. We hear from that New York Times story as well that besides Middle East peace and bringing government to the modern era, he also is working on NAFTA and even on the reentry of American prisoners into society. I mean, this is a very wide-ranging portfolio, and you wonder how one person can handle all of this. And it's, John Kelly, I'm sure, is asking the same question. Yeah, well, Kyle, reportedly the president privately, and this is according to a report, blames Kushner for Special Counsel Robert Mueller's widening probe. Now, we want to point out the president does deny that, but here's what the Washington Post is writing today. His still evolving role in the investigations of Russian election interference and possible obstruction of justice also make him a potential risk to President Trump, even as he enjoys the special status of being married to the boss's daughter, Ivanka, and serving as one of the president's senior confidants. So are we seeing the role of Jared Kushner evolve because of this investigation?
Sure. Well, there doesn't appear to be any direct evidence of that. No one at least is saying that on the record. We might actually think that it's better for Jared Kushner's mental health that his portfolio is reduced somewhat. But these constant questions about Jared Kushner's actions during the election, and the fact that the Senate Judiciary Committee is coming back for more documents, and this is not something that is unusual for Kushner. They've asked for more documents and more interviews and more emails before. It's a constant cloud kind of hanging over his presence in the White House, and it's something that us in the media are constantly asking questions about, and it's got to be hard for a White House with so much else to do. We talked about tax reform being a big issue this week, and yet here we are talking about Jared Kushner. So that's not good for any White House aide behind the scenes. You don't want to be that much of the focus. Right. Kelly Jan, I want to read another portion of this. But because it is interesting, from the New York Times, saying, according to 3 advisors to the president, Mr. Kelly has even discussed the possibility of Mr. Kushner and his wife Ivanka Trump departing the West Wing by the end of the year. Now, we want to be very clear here, and important to note, Chief of Staff Kelly does dispute this. But Kelly Jane, how possible is it that Jared Kushner and Ivanka would leave Washington? Yeah, Christy, my eyes kind of popped out of my head when I read that sentence myself, and I think it's quite remarkable that a story like the New York Times is even being published, and the one in the Washington Post, because they are talking to people anonymously, of course, but who are speaking out about the problems that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are bringing to the administration, and that was sort of unheard of a couple months ago. And this really shows one of the problems of nepotism. You bring in family members, it's very hard to get rid of them. Michael Flynn, when they found out he was going to be a liability, they got rid of him very quickly, at least when it became public that he was a liability. It's going to be a little harder with Jared and Ivanka, but what was sort of seemed impossible, it's starting to look possible. I mean, look at Rex Tillerson's State Department snubbing Ivanka Trump and not sending high-level delegation with her to India. So it does seem that the once untouchable Kushners are starting to look a little on shaky ground these days. Well, and he did, in all fairness, Mr. Kushner spoke to the Washington Post for their article, and he said that he welcomes the change. And apparently he was referring to John Kelly at that moment. He
says, quote here, "The order allows this place to function. My number one priority is a high-functioning White House because I believe in the president's agenda, and I think it should get executed." Kyle, your response to that, and do you believe that Kushner is going to be in the White House for the long haul?
Sure. Well, it seems like that's exactly what a top aide to the president should say. The fact is, no one really wants to go to work. Doesn't matter what job you're in. You don't want to go to work and have to have all this infighting and politicking to get your voice heard. You'd like an orderly workplace. So I do believe that statement. I have a hard time, given that Donald Trump is so isolated from the establishment, Republicans. He doesn't really have a traditional operation around him, political operation around him. I have a hard time believing that he would depart from that and fire his son-in-law. It seems like that would be some really awkward birthday parties and Thanksgivings at the Trump household if that were to ever happen, because it doesn't seem like Jared and Ivanka are going to go anywhere anytime soon.
All righty. Kelly Jane Torrance and Kyle Felcher, we appreciate both of you being with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy.
Thanks.
Sure. And be sure to tune in for State of the Union this morning as well. We've got Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Lindsey Graham, both on the show with Jake Tapper. That's State of the Union, 9 a.m. Eastern, right here on CNN.
The president's latest tweet about Time magazine is prompting this question. Is President Trump obsessed with being Time's Person of the Year?
And a little star power entering the Alabama Senate race. Charles Barkley coming out against Republican Roy Moore, but with only a few weeks until the election, obviously. How much sway does that have with voters?
Plus, why Pope Francis's controversial trip to Myanmar could endanger Christians? It's the final stretch of one of the most, I think this is safe to say, controversial elections of the year.
Yeah, and tomorrow is the deadline for voters to register an Alabama special election for a race that could see a Democrat flip a Senate seat in a deep red state. And tomorrow, that man there, Republican Roy Moore, making his first public appearance in nearly 2 weeks after 8 women came forward with allegations against him. We should point out Moore has continued to deny these allegations. But in a response, his opponent, Doug Jones, has a lot to say.
Yeah, he's been claiming that Moore is avoiding the campaign trail. He says that, quote, Roy Moore is hiding from his record, hiding from the media, and hiding from voters, disappearing for 10 days at a time and unwilling to go out and even work for their votes.
Doug Jones facing an uphill battle, though, to defeat Roy Moore. According to the Washington Post, he has to carry more than 90% of African-American voters and boost their turnout.
One endorsement that could go a long way is Alabama native turned Hall of Fame basketball player Charles Barkley.
Roy Moore is running with Steve Bannon as his right-hand man, who's a white separatist. I'm not even going to get into the women's stuff, but a guy, how can you be a white separatist and represent all the constituents in your state? I mean, everybody's going crazy over this sexual allegations. Roy Moore would have, to me, when he brought in Steve Bannon, should have been disqualified. I don't understand. I mean, to me, that's how can you have a guy who's running with a white separatist running for a political office? We got a lot of black people in the state who are amazing people, but to run a campaign with a guy as your chief advocate who is a white nationalist, a white separatist, that should have disqualified Roy Moore way before this women's stuff came up.
All right, so a race that has been very interesting gets even more so now. And back to talk about all of this is our panel. That's Kelly Jane Torrance, deputy editor of the Weekly Standard, and also Kyle Felcher, breaking news editor of the Washington Examiner. Thank you both for coming back. Kelly, let me ask you this. How significant, how important do you think that a Barkley endorsement is going to be? And will it change the conversation, especially about Doug Jones and Roy Moore?
That's an excellent question, Martin. And I think the biggest thing that it might affect is turnout. As you mentioned in the lead up here, Doug Jones has to win a lot of African Americans, it seems, to win that seat. And a lot of them probably are not really excited by Doug Jones. He's not exactly a thrilling candidate. So turnout is going to be very important in getting people, a little bit riled up, a little bit interested in getting out there for the special election. It's, December 12th, not a day that people normally have on their calendars. as an election. And I have to say Charles Barkley is partly right that Roy Moore should have been disqualified before all these allegations came out. But I think even before he brought on Steve Bannon, I mean, this is a man who proved as a judge that he does not believe in the rule of law. He thinks that we should have the rule of men, judges over the law. And I think that should have disqualified him from the beginning.
Yeah, he was twice removed from the Alabama Supreme Court. Let me ask you this, Kyle, though. Roy Moore has not made a public appearance. I've been following his campaign now for almost 3 weeks. He stayed off the campaign trail immediately after the allegations came forward. He's been absent. He runs ads, but you haven't seen a lot of him. And I'm wondering whether you think that that's been a good idea. Is that a good strategy for him?
Well, given Roy Moore's propensity to say outlandish things, we'll say, and be, just a kind of a firebrand to the point where, I mean, this is a man who also, who whipped out a gun during a campaign speech. Like, he's very unpredictable. So perhaps it actually was a good idea to, in the immediate aftermath of all of these allegations coming out, not have him out and in front of cameras and in front of microphones, if only because someone like that can often do more harm to themselves in a race than they can help. You would think that perhaps this is something that his staffers said, maybe for a little bit we'll just let this try and calm down, and we'll come back when things are a little more settled. Whether they're settled now is up for debate, obviously, but
clearly he's got to worry that there isn't some other woman or someone else who comes forward with some kind of allegation against him. Kelly, the president has hinted he might go down to Alabama and campaign for Roy Moore. Do you really think that's going to happen?
I think it's possible, and honestly, the more that people are shocked that Donald Trump is not disavowing the candidacy of Roy Moore, the more I wonder if he'll do it just to, upset the haters, as he likes to call them. We heard earlier on CNN that he's upset with his daughter for criticizing Roy Moore and the allegations against him. I think it's shocking that the White House is basically calling these 8 women, and who knows how many more might come forward, liars. And but the president's in a difficult position if he says that we should tend to believe women, especially when there's a group of them coming forward with similar allegations. Then he'd have to answer the question of why we shouldn't believe a different group of women with similar allegations against the president himself. So I think it's anyone's guess what he might do. I think more likely, though, we're going to see a early morning or late night tweet from Donald Trump endorsing Roy Moore, and that'll be without his aides around to stop him.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Kyle, let me just throw this at you. We know that this week that the House is going to pick up the issue of training, sexual harassment training for members of Congress. Seems like they're way behind on this when just about every person who works in any job has gone through that kind of training. What is happening here?
Well, it seems like this is something that is an outdated, really ancient process in Congress as a whole, that the sexual harassment training, there's been complaints from female lawmakers that essentially this process that's set up in Congress when a staffer complains of or alleges sexual harassment is actually set up to protect lawmakers and to silence these victims. So there's a cooling off period. There's times when essentially is to talk the women out of pressing forward with their allegations, according to some lawmakers. So this is kind of an overhaul process that's long overdue, and it's something that they're really going to have to take up and take seriously, because there's so much more coming out, and there keeps being these little rumbles saying there's going to be more coming, there's going to be more coming. So we'll have to see what this week brings. It's been just a roller coaster of how many more men and how many more lawmakers can be accused of this kind of thing.
Right. I think there is a sense that a lot of people feel there is much more to come. Kelly Jane Torrance and Kyle Felcher, thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.
Well, Pope Francis is making a historic trip to Myanmar. It's not without controversy. We're going to tell you what's going on.
Plus, how a murder case that's more than 10 years old is now catching fire online, thanks to interest from a certain A-list group of celebrities.
Well, We're always so glad to have you with us. I'm Christy Paul.
And I'm Martin Savage in for Victor Blackwell. Welcome back. It is so good to always be with you. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, he's got until tomorrow to hand over information on his security clearance.
Congressional committees are investigating if there were any inappropriate meetings or contacts between Russian officials and Trump associates during the 2016 campaign.
Meanwhile, the president is slamming the nation's top consumer watchdog group as a total disaster, as questions swirl on just who's going to be in charge tomorrow morning after its former director abruptly resigned.
Also, a critical week for tax reform. The president heads to Capitol Hill to meet with Republicans to talk about their tax plan and try to push it through. Now, the vote on the GOP tax plan, could this be the first major policy victory for the president and the GOP? Senators Bernie Sanders and Maria Cantwell debate Senators Ted Cruz and Tim Scott in a 90-minute CNN town hall. That's a debate. It's live from Washington and hosted by CNN's Jake Tapper and chief political correspondent Dana Bash. It's Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern, only here on CNN.
Pope Francis is leaving today. It is for a historic visit to Myanmar, but it's not without controversy. Myanmar was hailed as a hope for democracy.
But just last week, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson accused the state of ethnic cleansing against Muslims. CNN's Vatican correspondent Delia Gallagher, live from Rome. I want to read, Delia, what Father Thomas Rees said about this trip. He said Pope Francis is walking through the same minefield in Myanmar. If he's prophetic, he puts Christians at risk. If he's silent about the persecution of the Rohingya, he loses moral credibility. What is your reaction to that?
Well, Christy, this is probably one of the most diplomatically delicate trips for the Pope. As you mentioned, he's going at a time when both the UN and the U.S. have accused Myanmar's military of ethnic cleansing of its minority Muslim population, the Rohingyas, and even the language that the Pope uses, the word Rohingya, is considered inflammatory for Myanmar. So all of it will be scrutinized. At the same time, he is going to be a guest in the country, and what we've seen in the past with the Pope is that he doesn't tend to come out with a heavy hand and offend his hosts. At the same time, he is expected to defend the rights of minority populations in that country. So certainly it is a tricky tightrope for Pope Francis. If anyone could do it, we've seen he's a savvy diplomatic person. He is able to walk that fine line, but it will be a tough one. He will be meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi, perhaps Myanmar's most well-known government leader, and she has come under intense international criticism for not speaking out against the atrocities. But her defenders, which include the Catholic Cardinal of Myanmar, one of Pope Francis's top advisors on the trip, say she's not completely in control. It is the military in control. And so he will also be meeting in a crucial meeting with the head of Myanmar's military, the senior general there. And that will be a key meeting to see if Francis can succeed where others have failed. Christy, Martin?
Delia Gallagher, thank you very much for that. President Trump has called Time magazine paper thin and really flimsy. So why is the president obsessed with Time's Person of the Year? We'll discuss it next.
So a question here. Is the president obsessed with being Time magazine's Person of the Year? That's a question that's circling after President Trump tweeted this on Friday.
Time magazine called to say that I was probably going to be named Person of the Year, like last year, but I would have to agree to an interview and a major photo shoot. I said probably is no good and took a pass, thanks anyway. But Time magazine quickly shut down that, saying that the president is incorrect. Time's chief content officer adding this, amazing, not a speck of truth here.
Joining us now, Brian Stelter, CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources. Brian, good to see you. So despite what the president says, I mean, you think on the surface it seems like he wants this honor.
I think you're right about that. I'll admit this is not the most important, most consequential story in the whole world right now. But I do think it's insightful into the president's mindset, into how he thinks about the press and what he wants from big news outlets like Time Magazine. If you look at pictures of President Trump in the Oval Office, sometimes you'll see Time Magazine there on his desk. This is a magazine that he has been reading for decades. He cares a lot about getting attention from this magazine. There's even a fake version of Time Magazine that used to be hanging on the wall of a few of his golf clubs. So now that he's saying he took a pass on this Man of the Year title, by the way, there's that fake cover. I think that's so interesting that Washington Post found those back earlier this year and was able to find photographic proof of them. Not quite a real Time Magazine cover there on the walls of his golf club. As for the real Time Magazine, they're trying to decide who should the Man of the Year be, who should the Person of the Year be. There's actually a lot of suggestion that perhaps it'll be women, the women that came forward to accuse Harvey Weinstein of wrongdoing and then cause this international tipping point. I'm not sure what that cover would look like, if they'd highlight a single individual on the cover or a group of people. But there's a lot of options, obviously, for Time Magazine. President Trump would be one of the obvious options. Now that he says he doesn't want the title, we'll see what the editors ultimately decide to do.
Brian, one of the things you point out, and I thought the same thing too in the president's tweet, is the fact that he seems to imply he turned it down in part because he didn't want to give an interview. He has not really given interviews to legitimate news outlets for a long time.
That's why I think this actually is a significant tweet. He's saying that he turned it down because they would insist on an interview before giving him the title. I'm not sure if that's actually how it works in the Time Magazine process, but it's worth pointing out that for 6 months now, ever since Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel, President Trump really only speaks to friendly interviewers from Fox News, from right-wing radio, and places like that. He doesn't even necessarily give interviews to the journalists at Fox News. It's really just the opinion hosts who he believes are very, very friendly to him that he'll speak with. So we've seen a reluctance to give interviews by President Trump. At the same time, he's adding fuel to his media fire, criticizing Time and CNN and other outlets on Twitter. And by the way, none of that does anything to improve the economy or bring jobs back. It's just his venting, using Twitter to vent, of course. Although, come to think of it, maybe he'll sell a few more copies of Time Magazine.
I was thinking the same thing. Time's probably loving it all, yeah.
So what else are you talking about this morning, Brian?
Well, I mentioned a Barb against CNN. We're going to get into his back and forth about our sister channel, CNN International, and why he's criticizing that channel later today on Reliable Sources.
All righty. Thank you so much, Brian. Good to see you.
Thanks.
And again, as he said, he's not going anywhere. Brian Stelter on Reliable Sources at 11 a.m. Eastern today. It's right here on CNN. Well, Cyntoia Brown was just 16 when she was given a life sentence for murder for killing a 43-year-old man who she says was trying to have sex with her. Next, why some are fighting to give her case another look.
But first, in today's Staying Well segment, a study finds learning how to dance is good for your brain. And one Colorado couple says they're living proof.
Here we go.
And toning, and one group did dancing. And all of them participated for 6 months. In all other groups, we saw this typical age-related deterioration of their brains. In the dancing group, we observed some improvement in one of their.
Cyntoia Brown. She's been in prison for more than a decade now, but her case is catching fire on social media. Hashtag Free Cyntoia Brown after being shared on Instagram by pop superstar Rihanna. And here's the background. Brown says when she was just 16, after being forced into prostitution, a 43-year-old man took her home and tried to have sex with her. Brown says in self-defense, she shot him because she feared for her life. And despite her age, she was tried as an adult, sentenced to life in prison, and won't be eligible for parole until she's 69 years old. Well, one of the people trying to change that is with us now, her attorney, Charles Bone. Charles, thank you so much for being here with us. We appreciate it. First and foremost, I want to ask you, how is she doing, and is she aware of this new public campaign to try to help her?
Cyntoia is a remarkable young woman, and she's very aware. She's amazed by the publicity that's been generated this week.
Help us understand who she is now. I understand, I mean, she's been in prison for what, has it been about 13 years, and she's gotten a college degree? Is that right?
13 years, and she's gotten her GED and her Associate of Arts degree from Lipscomb University, and now she's very close to getting her bachelor's degree.
She, if what I read from her background is correct, suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome. She grew up in an abusive home where drugs were rampant. She ran away from adoptive parents. She was raped and forced into prostitution by a pimp, as I understand it. What was it about her and about this case that made you say, I need to try to help this woman?
Well, there's an amazing documentary that Dan Bierman did in 2010, and when we saw that documentary, a group of us with lawyers and others got together to say, you know, we need to do our best to see if we can right this wrong.
Yeah, I understand you filed a petition for post-conviction relief after the Supreme Court banned life without parole sentences for juveniles. What are your most pressing obstacles to making a release happen for her right now?
Well, the case will be heard in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals sometime in 2018. Also, we are in the process of asking the Board of Pardons and Paroles and the governor to consider an action that would commute her sentence and allow her to serve a much lighter sentence. Further, we hope that the legislature of Tennessee would take some action that would be of some help to her.
Okay, I want to bring Joey Jackson into the mix here because Joey, I think when a lot of people hear this story, realize that at 16 she was convicted as an adult of first-degree murder, first-degree felony murder, aggravated robbery. People aren't absolved, obviously, by public outcry, but what has to happen in the legal realm to secure her release here?
Well, first of all, good to see you, Christy, and let me compliment Charles Bone for undertaking this case. I think that needs to happen because you want to hold the system accountable. Understand it's an uphill battle, though, right? I mean, the biggest problem is you have a system that needs to balance three things, right? Punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Certainly you want to punish someone, but the issue now is at 16 years old is a sentence where she's up for parole at 69. Is that the appropriate punishment? Furthermore, when you look at a 16-year-old, you have to know that something is fundamentally different about brain development. What any of us do at 21, at 25, at 45, what we would do as a 16-year-old, I think the answer to that question is no. Having said that, and having read Mr. Bone's analysis in his brief here, you know, the question then becomes, when you look and analyze her actions, is a person dead? That person was 43 years old. There's the indication, at least from the prosecution, that he was shot and he was robbed because she took rifles and of course his wallet or his pants away from him. So the question is now, is the punishment appropriate? And based on all errors that were made at the trial level and the appellate level, is even perhaps a new trial in her future? And so that's something that's going to have to be looked at in addition to the remedies what Mr. Bone talked about, and that is whether there would be a commutation of the sentence to make it less, or whether there would be legislative action that would interpose a sentence that would be less than she would have now.
So Joey, when you read through this, what was your initial thought about the conviction and the sentence for it? Because on the outside, we thought, somebody make some sense of this for us.
You know, Christy, in looking at it, you know, the crime obviously is very heinous. And when I looked at that, you know, certainly it deserves punishment. Now, apparently at the trial level, the argument was self-defense. Apparently when she went to this man's home, you know, she was a prostitute being put up to it by her pimp named Cut. Apparently when she went to this man's home, he went to reach under the bed. And as a result of that, she was scared of what he would do, pulled out a pistol from her pocketbook that she was given by her pimp and shot him. And so obviously that was what was argued at trial, but it didn't carry the day. So now you look to whether or not, if she was convicted of this crime, what can happen now? And I know she has all these past histories of, you know, mental abuse and her mental deficiencies and the alcohol that her mother went through. And so the only thing you can hope for is that there would be a commutation of the sentence, or the sentence would be a bit less than it is now.
So Charles, Kim Kardashian even put on her Instagram, I've called my attorneys yesterday to see what can be done to fix this. How much influence do you think celebrities have in a case like this? Do they enact change, or is it the publicity that's so powerful here?
Well, well, actually it's both. I mean, we welcome